The deputy did not want to go. He sat in his saddle, adjusting the shovel lashed behind the cantle, the leather so cold it cracked when he shifted his weight. Behind him, 3 men and a sled carrying a pine box lid. Nobody spoke. The horse's breath hung in the air and broke apart in the wind, and the only sound was harness metal clicking against itself as they rode toward the river claim where the widow had been alone since the storm buried the prairie. They had not come to rescue anyone. They had come to dig. Then the deputy caught a smell on the wind, faint, impossible, and pulled his horse to a stop. Bread. Fresh bread. Baking somewhere inside the drift. Amalia Rehm had not come to Dakota Territory to die in it. She had come because Joseph said the soil was black and deep, because 160 acres cost nothing but 5 years of living, and because the Volga colonies had given them nothing to stay for. They filed in the spring of 1887 on a quarter section outside Redstone Crossing, Beetle County, flat grass running to a bend in the James River, where cottonwoods grew thick enough to cut and rounded stones lay in the shallows like bread loaves cooling on a shelf. Joseph built the shack in 9 days, 12 feet by 16, single-wall cottonwood boards, tar paper on the outside, flour sacks patched over the seams where the board shrank before the tar could hold. 1 window facing south, 1 cast-iron stove with a cracked firebox plate that glowed cherry red if you fed it hard and leaked smoke if you fed it soft, 1 stovepipe that ran straight through a tin collar in the roof. The shack was not a home, it was a receipt. It proved they lived on the land, and the land would become theirs if they kept living on it for 5 years. That was the law. The Homestead Act did not care whether you were comfortable. It cared whether you stayed. Joseph died in November. A freight wagon loaded with fence posts overturned on an icy grade 3 miles east of town. The teamster survived with a broken collarbone. Joseph, who had been walking alongside to steady the rear axle, went under the side rail. They brought him back on the same wagon, laid flat among the posts he had been hauling for 12 cents a mile. Amalia buried him on the claim. The ground was already starting to freeze, and she broke the topsoil with a mattock because the shovel bounced. The grave took her 2 days. When it was done, she stood beside it with dirt under every fingernail and looked at what Joseph had left her. 2 hens that laid every other day, 1 milk cow whose ribs showed through her winter coat, a cracked cast-iron stove, a woodpile that reached her waist and would not have reached her knee in a month, $11 in coin kept in a tin behind the flour bin, a stack of cottonwood boards meant for a lean-to that would never be built, and 160 acres of frozen grass that she could not sell, could not leave, and could not survive on. She had no family east. Her parents were dead in the Volga settlement. Her sister had married a man in Topeka and stopped writing 2 years before. She had no fare for a train even if she had somewhere to go. The claim was the only thing Joseph had left that was not already owed to someone. Amalia was 32 years old. She had never spent a Dakota winter alone. She did not know how many cords of wood a single-wall shack consumed between November and March. She did not know the answer to that question, but the answer was about to walk through her door and tell her. Marshal Daniel Brackett arrived on a Tuesday, 8 days after the burial. He was 54, former freighter, elected town marshal, and the kind of man who had survived enough to believe that survival was mostly arithmetic. He had seen frost kill cattle standing upright. He had seen a man freeze to death 60 yards from his own door because the snow erased the path and the wind erased the man's sense of direction. He did not come to offer sympathy. He came because the elders had asked him to assess whether the Rehm widow would make it through January, or whether the town should prepare to act before the ground got too hard to bury her. He stepped into the shack without removing his hat. His eyes went to the stove first, then the woodpile visible through the window, then the flour bin, then the bed where the quilt was pulled tight because there was no one to share it with anymore. "How much wood have you got stacked?" Brackett asked. "What is outside?" Amalia said. I looked. That is less than 1 cord. Joseph was going to cut more before. 1 cord, Brackett said. Maybe 1 1/4 if you count the green stuff underneath that will smoke worse than it burns. You need 6 cords to winter in these boards. 6 minimum. That stove eats wood like a threshing engine because the heat goes up the pipe faster than it goes into the room. The walls have no insulation to speak of. The floor has gaps I can see daylight through. He pointed at the base of the south wall where the boards met the sill log. Every crack is a draft. Every draft is fuel. You are burning wood to heat the sky. Amalia said nothing. Brackett walked to the stove and put his palm near the cracked firebox plate. This plate is split. You cannot run it hot without risking a chimney fire, and you cannot run it slow without filling the room with smoke. You have no backup. You have no coal. You have no relatives within riding distance who have offered to take you in. No one has offered. No, Brackett said. No one has. He looked at the $11 she had not hidden well enough. Cordwood is $2.75 a cord at Voss's yard. You cannot afford 3 cords. Even if you could, Voss does not deliver past the river after the first hard freeze because the grade is too steep for a loaded wagon on ice. Amalia stood with her hands flat on the table Joseph had built, pressing hard enough to keep them still. What are you telling me, Marshal? I'm telling you the math. Brackett pulled his hat lower. That shack will be a coffin before January is over. He did not wait for her to answer. He stepped outside, climbed into his saddle, and rode back to Redstone Crossing through a wind that was already pulling the warmth out of the ground. At the elders' meeting that evening, Brackett delivered his verdict in 5 words. She will not make February. He was not cruel. He was experienced, and in his experience was enough. What Brackett did not know, what nobody in Redstone Crossing knew or cared to ask, was where Amalia Rehm had come from before she came to Dakota. She had grown up in a German colony on the lower Volga, in a village where the winters came off the steppe with a sound like tearing linen, and the houses were built to answer them. Not with iron stoves, not with endless wood piles, with mass, with clay and stone and brick arranged so that fire did its work twice, once in the burning and once in the leaving. Her grandmother's house had a stove that filled an entire wall. Whitewashed, warm to the touch 12 hours after the last fire. Broad enough on top to sleep 2 children and a grandmother who smelled like rye flour and ash. The smoke did not go straight up. It traveled through baffles and channels and turns that Amalia could trace with her eyes closed, warming every course of brick before it left. Her grandmother had a phrase for iron stoves. She called them chimneys with a door. All fire, no memory. The heat went in and the heat went out, and you stood beside it shivering unless you fed it every hour. Amalia had not thought about that stove in years. She had not needed to. In the Volga colony, in Topeka, where she and Joseph had first landed, in the boarding house in Yankton, where they had waited for the filing, there had always been heat she did not have to understand. It had always been someone else's problem. Now it was hers. The realization came not as an idea, but as a sensation. She woke on the 9th night after Joseph's death to ice inside the water bucket. The stove had gone cold 2 hours before dawn because she had not woken to feed it. The stovepipe was still faintly warm to the touch, warmer than the room, warmer than the walls, warmer than her hands. The heat had not disappeared. It had gone up, through the pipe, through the tin collar, through the roof, into the Dakota sky where it fed nothing and warmed no one. She stood in the dark with her palm on the pipe and thought, the stove does not fail because it cannot make heat. It fails because it cannot keep it. And then, like a door opening in a wall she had forgotten was there, she thought of her grandmother's hand flat on the whitewashed brick. She heard the old woman's voice, accented, blunt, patient, the way stone is patient. Fire that runs away feeds the sky. Fire that stays feeds the house. Amalia looked at the cracked iron stove, the thin walls, the pipe running straight to the roof. She looked at the floor, cottonwood boards over bare earth. She looked at the stove again and saw not what it was, but what it was not. It was not stone. It was not brick. It was not mass. It had no memory. It could not hold what it made. She needed something that could. The idea did not arrive whole. It arrived as a question she could not stop turning. What if the heat did not go up? What if instead of a stovepipe carrying everything to the sky, the smoke traveled first through stone, through clay, through a path long enough and heavy enough to steal the warmth before releasing the smoke? Not a Russian stove. She did not have brick, did not have lime, did not have a mason or the money to hire one. But she had the river. The James River bend had stones, rounded, dense, heavy stones she could carry. She had clay from the cut bank where the water had carved into gray-blue earth, so sticky it held the shape of her fingers. She had sand from the shallows. She had willow brush and slough hay and dried cow chips for fuel, the same fuels every poor homesteader on the prairie burned when they could not afford wood. The design she imagined was not elegant. It was not a pechka. It was a platform, a sleeping bench, 7 feet long, 6 feet wide, 30 inches high, a firebox at the foot end, sized for a small, hot burn. 3 low channels running the length beneath a stone slab top, so the smoke would travel back and forth before climbing through a side chamber and out a clay-lined chimney. If the stone held heat the way her grandmother's brick had held heat, the bed itself would stay warm for hours after the fire died. She would sleep on the heat. She would keep water jugs beside it so they would not freeze. She would set her sourdough crock on the warm stone and let the yeast work through the night. It sounded, even in her own mind, like madness. She tested the principle the next morning with what she had. She laid 3 flat stones beside the stove. She set a bread pan upside down on 2 of them to create a channel. She ran a short piece of scrap stovepipe from a gap near the stove's cracked plate through the channel, letting it vent into the room. She fed the stove a hot charge of willow twigs. Smoke threaded through the pipe, through the channel, and out the open end. She let the fire burn 20 minutes and die. An hour later, the stone at the far end of the channel was still warm to the touch. Not warm enough, not nearly, but warm. She pressed her palm against it and felt the heat coming back to her hand, the way it had come back from her grandmother's wall, delayed, patient, stored. She had her answer. Heat could be kept. The question was whether she could build something large enough, tight enough, and safe enough to keep it through a Dakota night, and whether she could build it before winter decided she was out of time. Beret Haugen came the next afternoon. She was 41, Norwegian, built square as a church door, and she had homesteaded the adjacent quarter section with her husband Torsten and their 4 children for 3 years. She brought a jar of pickled beets and a face that said the beets were not the reason she had come. "I heard about the stove," Beret said. "Which part?" "The part where you are going to rip up your floor and fill your house with river rocks." Beret set the beets on the table and did not sit down. "Amalia, I have lived through 3 winters in a board shack. Stone eats heat before it gives any back. You will freeze waiting for it to wake up." "Iron gives heat and then forgets it," Amalia said. "I would rather wait for warm stone than keep feeding a stove that feeds the sky." "You are talking about tons of stone in your shack." on bare ground in November. Beret looked at the floor as though she were calculating its load. Even if the idea is right, you do not have the hands, you do not have the time, you barely have the body. I have the river. The river is 1.5 miles, downhill going, uphill coming back with stone on a sled, in the cold, alone. Amalia did not argue. She knew Beret was right about the labor. She knew Beret was right about the time. She also knew that Beret had not said the idea itself was wrong, only that the circumstances were impossible. And impossible circumstances were the only kind Amalia had. Beret left the beats and a silence that felt like a verdict. The silence did not last. Hiram Voss learned about the widow's plan the way Hiram Voss learned about everything in Redstone Crossing, through the kind of listening that looked like casual interest and functioned like inventory. He was 46, timber dealer, coal hauler, and the man who held more freight notes and unpaid tabs than anyone between the James River and the county seat. He sold cordwood at $2.75 a cord. He sold coal when he could get it freighted. He bought claims from people who could not hold them, improved them just enough to prove up, and sold them to newcomers at 3 times the filing cost. Joseph Rehm's freight note, $31 for hauling lumber and fence posts through the fall, sat in Voss's ledger like a seed. If Amalia abandoned the claim, the note became uncollectible, but the land became available. If she sold the claim to cover the debt, Voss would own 160 acres on the river bend for the cost of wages he had already written off. Either way, the widow's failure was Voss's profit. A woman building a stone bed in a board shack was a woman burning daylight she did not have, and every day she wasted brought the claim one day closer to his hand. He arrived at her door on a Saturday with 2 men she recognized from the lumber shed. Mrs. Rehm. He did not tip his hat. I understand you are pulling stones from the river. I am. I see. He looked past her into the shack. I have your husband's freight note, $31, due on delivery, which was October. He produced the paper, folded once, held it where she could see the figures but not take it. You have $11, maybe less by now. I know what I owe. Then you know you cannot pay it and build a stove out of rocks at the same time. He smiled the way a man smiles when he knows the arithmetic is on his side. I have a fair offer. I will buy the claim for the balance of the note plus $5. That gives you $36 free and clear. Enough for a train ticket east and a month's board when you get there. Amalia looked at the note in his hand. She looked at the 2 men behind him, brought along so they could witness her answer and repeat it to anyone who asked. The claim is not for sale. Mrs. Rehm. The claim is not for sale, Mr. Voss. I filed on this land with my husband. I intend to prove up on it. Voss's smile did not change, but something behind it did. A woman who builds a bed out of rocks, he said, loud enough for the witnesses, has already lost her senses. He folded the freight note and put it back in his coat. When the cold decides for you, the offer will be lower. He turned and walked back to his wagon, and the 2 men followed, and Amalia stood in the doorway with her hands at her sides and her jaw locked shut because if she opened her mouth she would scream, and if she screamed she would not stop, and if she did not stop then Hiram Voss would be right about her senses. She did not scream. She closed the door. She picked up her coat and her gloves and the canvas sling she had sewn from a flour sack, and she walked to the river to haul more stone. The next day, Brackett returned. He did not come inside this time. He stood at the edge of the turned earth where Amalia had begun pulling up floorboards and looked at the growing pile of river stones beside the shack wall. You're taking up the floor. I am building on the ground underneath. The ground is frozen. 2 inches down. Below that, the clay is soft. Brackett crouched and looked at the exposed earth where 3 boards had been removed. He pressed his thumb into the soil. His thumb sank. If you lay stone on this, the weight will settle unevenly. You will crack your own flue before the first burn. I am laying a pad of flat stones and clay first, 3 inches, then the base. Where did you learn masonry? I did not learn masonry. My grandmother had a stove that held heat. I'm trying to build a small version of what she had. Brackett stood. He wiped his thumb on his coat. He looked at the pile of stones, the torn-up floor, the woman who was 32 and alone and doing something no one in Redstone Crossing had ever seen done. That stove your grandmother had, how big was it? It filled 1 wall of the house. And how many men built it? Amalia did not answer because the answer was 3 masons over 2 weeks, and she knew what Brackett would say if she told him. Brackett nodded, reading her silence. You are building a 3-man job alone in a shack that cannot take the weight, with stone that is not cut, using clay you dug from a riverbank. He looked at her the way he had looked the first time, not with contempt, but with the exhausted patience of a man who had seen too many people die of optimism. I hope I am wrong, Mrs. Rehm. I have been wrong before, but not about winter. He left. The wind followed him. That night, Amalia lay on the remaining floorboards beside the pit she had dug for the base pad, and she listened to the cracked stove tick and cool, and she counted the things she did not know how to do. She did not know how to build a proper flue. She did not know how to seal clay so it would not crack in heat. She did not know how to prevent the smoke from backing into the room instead of drawing through the channels. She did not know how to build a chimney that would pull in a crosswind. She did not know any of these things, and not knowing any one of them could fill the shack with smoke and kill her in her sleep. She needed someone who understood masonry, draft, and clay. She needed someone who could teach her before winter closed the last window. She did not know that someone was 3 miles away, living in a dugout, and had already heard about the widow hauling stones. Amalia started work on the base pad the next morning. She cleared a 7 by 6 foot rectangle of earth, 2 feet inside the south wall, and began laying flat stones into the clay. She worked on her knees, fitting stones like puzzle pieces, filling gaps with clay mixed with sand from the riverbank. By noon, her back was a single locked ache and her fingers were cracked from the wet cold. She hauled stone in the afternoons. The route was 1.5 miles to the river bend, downhill on frozen grass, and 1.5 miles back, uphill, dragging a makeshift sled made from Joseph's unfinished lean-to boards with rope runners. Each trip brought 40 to 60 pounds. She could manage 3 trips before dark. That was 120 to 180 pounds a day. She needed 2,000. She did the math every night, and the math never improved. By the end of the first week, she had 400 pounds of stone piled inside the shack and a base pad that covered half the rectangle. The cracked stove still heated the room, barely, but every board she had removed from the floor let more cold seep up from the ground. She was making the shack colder to build something that might make it warmer, and the gap between those 2 states was filled with nothing but faith and labor. Her hands split at the knuckles, blood froze in the cracks before it could scab. She wrapped them in strips from Joseph's spare shirt and kept hauling. The cows stopped giving milk on the 4th day. Amalia did not know if it was the cold or the poor feed or the stress of the changed routine. But the milk pail stayed empty and stayed empty, and that was protein and fat she could not replace. She ate sourdough and boiled oats and pickled beets from Beret's jar, and she lost weight she did not have to lose. At the lumber shed in Redstone Crossing, Voss told his customers about the widow. He did not need to exaggerate. The facts were enough. A woman alone, pulling stones from a frozen river, tearing up her own floor, building something out of clay and rock that no one in the territory had ever seen. She is building herself a tomb with a chimney, he said, and the men laughed, and the laughter carried the way all laughter carries in a small town, outward, in every direction, until it reached even the people it was meant to wound. Have you ever built something that everyone around you said would fail? Tell us in the comments. We want to hear your story. Because what Amalia did not know yet was that someone was watching who had seen this kind of building before, and what happened next changed everything. The woman appeared on the 9th day of construction, late in the afternoon, when Amalia was on her knees bedding stones into clay, and her shadow was longer than the shack. She came on foot from the north, wrapped in a coat that had been mended so many times it had no original color, carrying a canvas bag over one shoulder, and walking with the deliberate pace of someone who had decided where she was going before she left. She stopped at the edge of the turned earth and looked at the pit, the stones, the base pad, the pile of unsorted river rock, and the crude drawing Amalia had scratched into the frozen clay beside the door, a rectangle with 3 wavy lines running through it and a box at one end marked with an X. She studied the drawing for a long time. "Your channels are too narrow," the woman said. Amalia looked up. She saw a face that was old, but not frail, 60, maybe more, with cheekbones that caught the last light, and eyes that were already reading the shack the way Brackett had read it, except this woman was not reading for failure. She was reading for method. "Who are you?" "Raisa Kravitz. I deliver babies. I also bury people who build flues wrong." She set down her bag and crouched beside the drawing. "You want the smoke to travel, but if the channels are this narrow, the draft will stall and the smoke will come back at you. The path must be wide enough for air to move, but low enough for heat to touch the stone above and below." "You know about stoves?" "My husband built stoves for 30 years. I mixed his mortar, held his line, and cleaned up when he died." Raisa touched the drawing with one finger. "This is not a stove, but it wants to be." Amalia sat back on her heels. Her hands were bleeding again through the cloth wraps. Her back ached. She had 400 pounds of stone and needed 2,000. And winter was coming with the patience of something that had never once been late. "Can you teach me?" she asked. Raisa looked at her. Not at the shack, not at the drawing, not at the stone, at her. At the split hands and the thin face and the stubborn set of her shoulders. "I can teach you enough to not kill yourself," Raisa said. "After that, it is between you and the stone." She picked up her bag and walked into the shack, and the education of Amalia Rehm began. Raisa's first lesson was draft. She lit a candle, a stub from her own bag, and held it near the cold stovepipe. The flame leaned toward the pipe, then wavered, then pulled sideways as a gust came through the wall cracks. "You see that?" Raisa said. "The air in your chimney is cold. Cold air is heavy. It sits in the pipe like a plug. If you light a fire underneath, the smoke pushes up against that plug and loses. The smoke comes back into the room. You breathe it. If you are asleep, you do not wake up." "How do I fix it?" "You warm the chimney first, a twist of hay, lit and held at the base of the flue. The hot air rises, pulls the cold air out, and the draft begins. Once the draft catches, the fire can burn. But if the draft fails, if the wind shifts, if the chimney cools, if the channel is blocked, the smoke comes back." She looked at Amalia hard. "Every time, without warning, you will never close a damper while there is flame in the box. You will never block a clean out while there is smoke in the channel. Those are not suggestions. Those are the rules that keep you breathing." "My grandmother never talked about draft." "Your grandmother had a chimney built by a mason who knew what he was doing. You have a hole in your roof with a pipe through it." Raisa blew out the candle. "We begin from nothing. That is honest." The next day, Raisa taught thermal mass. She selected 2 stones from the pile, one thin and flat, no thicker than 2 fingers, and one dense river cobble the size of a man's head. She placed both beside the stove and fed the fire hot for 30 minutes. "Touch the thin one," she said. Amalia touched it, warm, almost hot. "Now touch the thick one." Barely warm. Amalia frowned. "Wait," Raisa said. They waited. An hour. The fire died to coals, and the coals died to ash. Amalia touched the thin stone again. Cold. She touched the thick one. Still warm, not hot, but warm, steady, patient, holding what it had taken. "The thin stone is like your iron stove," Raisa said. "It takes heat fast and gives it back fast, and then it is done. The thick stone is slow, stubborn. It makes you wait. But it remembers." She hefted the cobble and turned it in her hands. "Your platform must be thick. Your channels must be surrounded by mass, stone above, stone below, stone on the sides. The smoke passes through and leaves its heat in the stone. The stone gives that heat to the room all night, not fast, not generous, slow and even, like a woman who has learned patience the hard way." Amalia thought of her grandmother's wall, the warmth that lingered, the way you could press your back against it at midnight and feel the afternoon's fire still breathing inside the brick. "How thick?" she asked. "As thick as you can build and still fit through your door." On the 3rd day, Raisa taught clay. She rejected 14 of Amalia's stones before accepting one. She held each to her ear and tapped it with a knuckle, listening. She dropped 2 in a bucket of water and watched for bubbles. "Those have water trapped inside," she said, pointing to the ones that bubbled. "Water near fire turns to steam. Steam expands. The stone cracks. Maybe it cracks slow and you lose a channel wall. Maybe it cracks fast and throws a piece into your face." She tossed both stones out the door. "Only dry, dense stone. No cracks, no pores. If you are not sure, leave it in the pile and find one you are sure about." The mortar she mixed was clay, river sand, and chopped straw. Nothing Amalia could not find within a mile. But the proportions mattered. Too much clay, and it would shrink and crack when the heat hit it. Too much sand, and it would crumble. The straw held it together while it dried, and gave the mortar a texture Raisa tested by squeezing it in her fist. If the shape held, and the surface showed straw fibers without crumbling, the mix was right. "Where the stone is near the wall," Raisa said, pointing to the south side where the platform would come within 2 feet of the cottonwood boards. "You will build a clay shield 6 inches thick, packed, not mortared, with an air gap behind it. The wood wall must never touch the hot stone, not through mortar, not through clay, not through anything, air between them, always. Always. Always, or the wall catches fire in the night, and you burn instead of freeze, and the men in town get to say they were right about everything." Amalia spent that evening sorting every stone she had hauled, separating dense from porous, dry from suspect, flat from round. She discarded almost a third. The pile she needed grew while the pile she had shrank. The math was worse now. She needed more stone and better stone, and November was half gone, and every morning the ground was harder, and the river shallows had a skin of ice that she broke with her boot before she could reach the good rock underneath. But she knew things she had not known a week ago. She knew why heat moved and where it went, and how to make it stay. She knew what would kill her if she built wrong, and what would save her if she built right. She had a teacher, and the teacher had a dead husband's 30 years of knowledge living in her hands, and that knowledge was flowing from those hands into Amalia's like water, filling a channel that had been waiting, empty, for something to carry. Outside, the wind picked up from the north. It was not the killing wind, not yet, but it carried the smell of what was coming: cold metal, dry snow. The particular silence that falls over a prairie when the sky begins to drop. Amalia had 31 days until January 12th. She did not know that number. Nobody did. The blizzard was not on any calendar. It was out there somewhere on the northern plains, gathering itself like a held breath, waiting for the morning that would fool everyone into believing winter had turned gentle. She knelt in the half-finished pit and set a stone into wet clay and pressed it level with her bleeding hands and thought, I need to be faster. She was not fast enough. Not yet. But she was not alone anymore, and that changed the arithmetic in ways that Brackett's math could not account for. The stove ticked. The wind leaned against the walls. Somewhere in Redstone Crossing, Hiram Voss recorded the widow's debt in his ledger and calculated the cost of patience. Somewhere in a dugout 3 miles north, Raisa Kravitz packed her bag for the morning walk, and somewhere out beyond the curve of the earth, the cold waited. It had time. It always had time. Amalia did not. The construction ate November. Amalia hauled stone every morning and built every afternoon and learned every evening when Raisa walked 3 miles from her dugout to inspect the day's work by lamplight. The routine became a rhythm, and the rhythm became a kind of prayer, repetitive, physical, performed whether she believed it would be answered or not. Raisa did not come every day. She came when she chose, and she chose based on what Amalia had done wrong the day before. If the mortar joints were tight and the channel walls were plumb, Raisa stayed away and let Amalia work. If a stone had been set crooked, or the clay was too wet, or a channel wall leaned inward where it should have been straight, Raisa appeared at dusk like a verdict and made Amalia tear out the mistake and rebuild it before dark. You do not fix bad masonry by building over it, Raisa said the third time she ordered a section demolished. You fix it by removing it. A crooked stone at the bottom becomes a collapsed channel at the top. Then the smoke backs up. Then you die. You keep saying that because you keep needing to hear it. They argued. Not about whether to build, Raisa had committed to that the moment she walked into the shack, but about how. Amalia wanted speed. She wanted to lay stone fast, seal it fast, move on to the next section. Raisa wanted precision. She wanted every joint tested with a thin stick pushed through the mortar line to check for gaps. She wanted every channel stone tapped and listened to before it was set. She wanted the work done right more than she wanted the work done soon, and the distance between right and soon was measured in days Amalia did not have. Winter does not wait for good masonry, Amalia said one evening, on her knees in the pit with clay under her nails, and tears she refused to acknowledge. No, Raisa said, but bad masonry does not wait for winter either. It fails whenever it chooses. The disagreement never resolved. It lived between them like a third person in the room, necessary, uncomfortable, present in every stone they set. By late November, Amalia had hauled 1 ton. She knew the number because Raisa made her count. Every sled load weighed between 40 and 70 pounds. Raisa made her estimate each load before setting it down and scratched the number on the cabin wall with a nail. The marks accumulated like tally scratches in a cell. When they reached 2,000, Raisa said, "Good. Now you need another 1,000 for the chimney and the slab cap." "You did not tell me that." "You did not ask." The first hard freeze came on November 28th. The river shallows froze solid overnight, and the good stone, the dense round cobble that Raisa approved, lay under 3 inches of ice. Amalia broke through with a hand axe, kneeling on the frozen mud, swinging at ice until her arms trembled and the axe handle slipped in her cracked hands. She pulled 11 stones that day instead of her usual 20. She ate less, not by choice, by arithmetic. The hens laid every other day, sometimes every third. The cow stood dry and thin in the lee of the shack, eating hay Amalia could not spare. The $11 had become $7 after she bought salt, lamp oil, and a pound of coffee that she rationed into a half cup each morning because the warmth of it was the only thing that made the first hour of each day bearable. The sourdough starter lived in a crock beside the stove, and she baked every 3 days, flat, heavy loaves that tasted like survival and filled the cabin with a smell that made the work seem possible. Raisa brought food when she came, not charity, barter. She brought boiled eggs, dried fish, and once a jar of rendered lard, and in exchange, Amalia let her take leftover clay mortar for patching her own dugout. The trades were unequal. Raisa's food was worth more than scraps of clay, but both women pretended otherwise, and the pretending was its own form of kindness. The platform grew. By December 5th, the base pad was complete, a 7 by 6 foot rectangle of flat stone set in clay, level enough that Raisa could roll a round stone across it without the stone catching. On top of the pad, the channel walls rose, 2 parallel walls, 18 inches apart, running the length of the platform. Between the walls, 3 channels, each one a path for smoke to travel, heating the stone above and below as it passed. Raisa showed Amalia how to build the first turn. The smoke would enter the channel from the firebox at the foot end, travel 7 feet to the far wall, turn through a curved clay passage, travel back 7 feet in the second channel, turn again, and travel a third time before rising through a side bell chamber and into the chimney. 21 feet of horizontal travel. Every foot of that path was a foot of stone, absorbing heat that would otherwise have gone straight up a pipe and into the sky. Your grandmother's stove had more turns than this, Raisa said. Maybe 30 feet of path, maybe more. Brick holds heat better than river stone, and lime mortar seals better than clay. We do not have brick. We do not have lime. We have what the river gave us and what the bank gave us, and that is enough if we are careful, and not enough if we are not. Will it work? Raisa did not answer with words. She put her hand on the channel wall they had just finished and held it there. Ask me in January, she said. Masakyai. The first full test burn came on December 10th. Amalia built a small fire in the firebox, willow sticks and dry hay, nothing more, and closed the iron door she had traded Joseph's wool coat for. The smoke entered the channel. They watched the clean-out stone at the first turn. Raisa held her candle near the gap. The flame bent toward the channel. Draft was pulling. They waited. 5 minutes. 10. Smoke threaded through the first channel, rounded the turn, entered the second. At the far end, a thin stream leaked from a mortar joint Amalia had not packed tightly enough. Raisa marked it with a clay dab. The smoke continued into the third channel, slower now, cooler, its heat surrendered to the stone it had passed through. It rose through the side bell and into the chimney stub Amalia had built from stacked stone and clay. It worked. The smoke drew. The channels held. The mortar did not crack. And then it stopped working. The chimney stub, only 4 feet tall and not yet lined, cooled in a gust of north wind. The draft reversed. Smoke backed through the bell chamber, through the third channel, and into the room in a gray rolling wave that burned Amalia's eyes and filled her lungs before she could reach the door. Raisa was already moving. She pulled the clean-out stone at the first turn and let the smoke vent directly out of the channel into the room near the floor, where it was less dangerous than at face height. She opened the door. She grabbed Amalia's arm and dragged her outside into air that was 12 degrees and felt like mercy. They stood in the yard, coughing, eyes streaming, while smoke poured from the shack door like a chimney running backwards. The chimney is too short, Raisa said when she could speak, and the wind caught it at the wrong angle. You need 2 more feet of stack, a clay liner, and a rain cap. I nearly died. Yes. Raisa wiped her eyes. That is what draft failure looks like. Now you know. Now you will not forget. Voss heard about the smoke. Of course he did. By evening, the story had traveled from Raisa's appearance at the general store, where she bought stovepipe wire and said nothing about why to the men at the lumber shed, who filled in the details themselves. She smoked herself out of her own shack. Voss told anyone who listened, she will not need a burial party. She is curing herself like ham. The laughter traveled. It always traveled. Amalia rebuilt the chimney in 2 days, adding 2 feet of stacked stone with clay liner and a flat capstone propped on 4 small rocks to keep rain and snow out while letting smoke escape. The second test burn drew clean. The third drew clean. The fourth drew clean, even when Raisa stood outside and threw snow at the chimney opening to simulate wind-driven precipitation. By Christmas, the platform was shoulder high when Amalia knelt beside it, but the slab cap was not on. The top was open, 3 channels visible like ribs in a body she had not yet closed. She needed 40 flat stones, each at least 2 inches thick and broad enough to span the channel walls. The river had given her round stones easily. Flat stones were harder. She split what she could with a cold chisel and a hand sledge borrowed from Beret's husband, but splitting stone in December on the Dakota Prairie was work that bruised her forearms purple and sent chips into her face no matter how she turned. Beret came on Christmas Eve. She did not come alone. She brought her 2 oldest boys, Torsten Jr., 14, and Petter, 12, and a stone boat, a flat wooden sled built for dragging field stone behind a horse. Beret's draft horse stood in the yard, breathing steam, while the boys unloaded the stone boat and looked at Amalia's shack with the wide eyes of children who had heard their mother's warnings and now saw the reason for them. "You will kill that cow hauling alone," Beret said. She did not explain further. She did not say she believed in the heater. She did not say she had changed her mind. She looked at Amalia's hands wrapped in cloth strips that were brown with old blood, and at Amalia's face, which was thinner than it had been a month ago, and at the platform rising inside the shack like something between furniture and faith. "The boys will haul flat stone from the river for 3 days," Beret said. "After that, we need them home." "Thank you." "Do not thank me. Just do not die. I do not want to explain to my children why I helped a woman build something that killed her." The boys hauled. In 3 days, they brought enough flat stone to cap the channels. Amalia set each slab on clay mortar, pressing and testing, tapping with her knuckle the way Raisa had taught her. Raisa watched the final stones go on and said nothing until the last one was level. "It is ugly," Raisa said. "It is finished." "It is not finished. It is closed. Finished comes after the first winter." By January the 10th, 1888, the masonry sleeping platform filled half the cabin. It was not beautiful. It was clay smeared, patched in 3 places where mortar had cracked during curing, and too large for the room by any measure that cared about comfort. Amalia had narrow paths around it, 18 inches on the south side, 2 feet on the north where the old stove still stood. The firebox door, an iron clean outdoor salvaged from a ruined cook stove, faced the foot of the bed. The chimney rose through a new hole in the east wall, lined with clay and fitted with a salvaged stovepipe section for the last 2 feet. She fired it twice a day, morning and evening. Short, hot burns, willow sticks, hay twists rolled tight as rope, dried manure straw blocks that Raisa taught her to press from cow dung and chopped slough grass. The fuel mix stank when it burned, but burned hot. and the heat passed through 21 feet of channel and left itself in 2 tons of stone. Early results. After a hard evening burn, the bed surface stayed warm until morning. Not hot. Warm. A hand pressed flat on the stone slab at midnight felt what Amalia's hand had felt on her grandmother's wall 20 years and 4,000 miles away. Heat stored, heat remembered, heat given back to the body that needed it. She measured with the cheap wall thermometer Joseph had nailed beside the door. Near the door, 34 degrees on a cold night. Beside the bed, 52. Under the quilt, on the stone, warm enough that she slept without waking. The water bucket near the bed did not freeze. The sourdough crock, set on the warm stone, rose slow and steady through the night, and the bread she baked in the residual heat after the morning fire died came out dense and dark and tasting like the rye her grandmother had made. Brackett visited on January 9th. He stood inside the door and did not sit down. He looked at the platform, the clay chimney, the narrow pathways, the firebox door. He put his palm on the stone surface and held it there. "It is warm," he said. "Yes." "In here, today, with no wind." He looked at the south wall, where the cottonwood boards were still single layer, still patched with flour sacks, still letting cold in through every crack. "The real test is not a calm night, Mrs. Rehm. It is wind. No stove beats a Dakota north wind, not iron, not stone, not anything a person builds." "This is not a stove." "No," Brackett said, studying the platform as though it were a problem he had not been asked to solve and could not stop solving anyway. "No, it is not." He left without delivering a verdict, which was the closest thing to hope Amalia had received from him. January 12th, 1888, began warm. The morning was so mild that Amalia opened the shack door and let the cow stand in sun that felt like late October, not midwinter. The thermometer read 34 degrees at dawn. By 10 it had climbed past 40. The snow on the south-facing roof began to drip. Birds moved. The silence that had pressed the prairie flat for weeks lifted, and sounds returned. Ice cracking in the river, a distant wagon, the hens scratching at thawed ground. Amalia did not trust it. She could not say why. She had no barometer, no weather knowledge beyond what her body told her, and her body told her that warmth in January on the Dakota plain was not a gift. It was a question that had not yet been answered. She fired the platform hard that morning, a double load of willow and hay twists. She stacked 3 extra fuel bundles inside the door. She filled the water bucket from the pump. She brought the cow inside and tied her in the corner near the old iron stove, which she also fed with the last half cord of cottonwood. 2 heat sources, 1 stored, 1 burned. By 2 in the afternoon, the warmth was gone. It did not leave gradually. It was taken. The temperature dropped like a stone down a well, 40 degrees, 30, 20, and falling. The wind arrived from the northwest with no warning, no gradual build, no shift in the clouds. One moment the air was still. The next, the shack shuddered on its foundation, and the south window went white. The snow was not snow. It was the air turning solid, fine as flour, dry as dust, driven horizontal by a wind that had no edges and no pauses. Visibility collapsed. The yard vanished. The pump, 20 feet from the door, vanished. The world shrank to the 12 by 16 interior of a cottonwood shack and the 2 tons of stone inside it that held in their channels and slabs the heat of that morning's fire. The children's blizzard had arrived. The first crisis was draft. The wind hit the chimney from the northwest and drove a fist of cold air down the flue. Smoke backed into the room, not the full reversal of the December failure, but a seep, a gray film that stung Amalia's eyes and told her the chimney was losing the fight. She remembered Raisa's candle. She remembered the lesson. She opened the bypass crack, a small gap Raisa had insisted on between the firebox and the chimney base, sealed with a loose stone that could be removed, and lit a twist of hay directly beneath the chimney opening. The twist burned fast and fierce. The hot air shot up, met the cold downdraft, and pushed it back. The chimney coughed, then drew. Smoke cleared. She sealed the bypass and fed the firebox. Not a slow burn, not a smolder. A hot, fast charge of dry fuel that would flame for 20 minutes and leave its heat in the stone. That was the rule. Hot fire, long path, clear breath. The wind screamed outside, and the walls shook, and the flour sack patches over the seams inflated and deflated like lungs. But the smoke drew through the channels and up the chimney, and the stone beneath Amalia's hand was warm. The second crisis came 40 minutes later, pounding on the door. Not wind, fists. Amalia unlatched the door and the wind tore it open and drove snow into the room in a horizontal sheet. A shape fell through the doorway, small, ice-caked, rigid. Eli Haugen, 9 years old, Beret's youngest daughter. The child had been separated from a sled team returning from a neighbor's claim 2 miles east. The sled had turned for home when the wind hit. Eli had been sitting on the back. When the sled lurched over a drift, she fell off, and the wind and snow swallowed her before anyone could turn around. She had walked, crawled, stumbled, walked again, until she found the shack not by sight, but by collision. She hit the east wall with her shoulder and followed it to the door. Her mittens were frozen into fists. Her eyelashes were white. She was not crying. Children in the last stage of cold do not cry. They go quiet. Amalia dragged her inside, slammed the door, and braced it with the stove iron because the latch was shaking loose. The room temperature had dropped 10 degrees in the 30 seconds the door had been open. Snow covered the floor in a white arc. She stripped the frozen layers off Eli, coat, mittens, scarf, boots. The child's fingers were white. Her feet were white. Amalia laid her on the warm stone platform, pulled the quilt over her, and pressed her own body against the child's back to add what heat she had. Eli, stay awake. No answer. Eli. A sound, not a word. A sound. Amalia pulled bricks from the stack Raisa had told her to keep near the firebox for exactly this purpose. She set 2 bricks on the stone slab where the channels ran closest to the surface. Within minutes, the bricks warmed. She wrapped them in cloth and pressed them against Eli's feet, against her hands, against her stomach. She fed the firebox again. More willow, more hay. The fire roared, and the stone ate the heat and held it and gave it to the child lying on top of it. Eli's fingers went from white to mottled red. She cried. The pain of returning warmth is worse than the cold that took it, and the crying was the sound of blood moving back into flesh that had started to die. Stay awake, Amalia said. Do not sleep. It hurts. I know. That means it is working. The third crisis came in the dark. The cabin door began to drift shut from outside. Snow packed against it, not just against the door, but against the entire north wall, building in a wave driven by wind that had not paused in 6 hours. The door pushed inward under the weight. The latch groaned. If the drift sealed the door completely, they would have no exit, no ventilation from the door cracks that supplemented the chimney draw, and no way for anyone to reach them. Amalia tied a length of rope from the bed's base stone to the door latch to keep the door from being pushed open by the weight, then took the bread peel, a flat wooden paddle, and the coal shovel and dug inward through the gap, scooping snow from the threshold and packing it against the inside wall where it would melt slowly and not block the path. She could not go outside. The storm had erased the yard, the pump, the world. There was nothing beyond the door but white noise and killing cold. She dug for an hour. The drift rebuilt itself in minutes. She dug again. The wind was patient. It had all night. She had a bread peel. If you are invested in what happens to Amalia and this child, hit subscribe and stay with us, because what happens next in this cabin is something the entire town believed was impossible. In Redstone Crossing, Brackett argued for a rescue team. He stood in Voss's store, the only building large enough for a meeting, and said what he had come to say. The Rehm woman is alone on the river claim. If she is alive, she will not be by morning. Voss answered from behind his counter. You cannot see 5 feet past the door. You send men now, you lose the men. Brackett looked at the faces in the room. Farmers, storekeepers, freighters, men with families, men who had their own stoves to feed, and their own walls to patch, and their own children to keep warm. Just see, we wait until morning, the elder said. Morning came. The storm did not stop. It thinned, thickened, thinned again. The drifts climbed past windows. Telegraph wire went down somewhere east. No mail, no freight. The town turned inward, and every household burned fuel at a rate that made the winter's arithmetic worse, and Amalia Rehm's claim might as well have been on the moon. Beret Haugen discovered Eli was missing at nightfall on the 12th. She had assumed the child was with the sled team. The sled team had assumed the child was with the next sled. By the time the error surfaced, the storm had made searching impossible. Beret stood in her doorway screaming Eli's name into a wind that carried the sound nowhere. Torsten held her back from walking into the white. She fought him. She bit his forearm through his coat sleeve. He did not let go. They stood in the doorway together, 2 people staring into a wall of moving snow, and Beret's voice went hoarse, and then it went silent, and then there was nothing to do but close the door and wait for a morning that might never bring back what the evening had taken. 3 miles south, Amalia Rehm did not know any of this. She did not know the child on her stone platform had a mother tearing at her husband's coat. She only knew that the child was alive, the stone was warm, and the wind was trying to take both. Inside the shack, Amalia fought through the second night. The platform held. That was the sentence she repeated to herself, the prayer and the proof and the thing that kept her moving when her body wanted to stop. The platform held. The stone was warm. The channels still drew. The fire she fed it every 2 hours, small, hot, fast, replenished what the walls lost to the wind. But the walls lost constantly. Every gust forced cold through the cottonwood boards. The flour sack patches fluttered and pulled at their nails. The south window glass collected frost on the inside so thick Amalia could scrape it with her thumbnail and form a ball of ice the size of a thimble. She stuffed rags into the worst cracks, pushed hay against the base of the north wall where the draft cut across the floor like a blade, and hung Joseph's canvas coat over the window as a second layer. None of it was enough. All of it together, added to the heat bleeding from the stone, was enough. The cabin was not warm the way a heated house is warm. The air near the door hovered at freezing. The air 2 feet above the platform was livable, 48 degrees, maybe 50. The quilt, the stone, and the child's body formed a zone of survival that the blizzard could claw at but could not reach. She fed the fire every 2 hours. She did not sleep. Each time she opened the firebox door, the orange light threw her shadow huge against the far wall, and the willow caught fast, and the heat entered the channels with a sound like breathing, a low draw of air that meant the chimney was pulling. The smoke was moving. The system was alive. She counted fuel bundles after every burn. 14 left, 12, 10. She would need to burn the last of the cottonwood boards from the lean-to pile if the storm held another day. She stacked them near the firebox and tried not to think about what came after. Eli woke in the deepest part of the night and said she was hungry. Amalia gave her bread. The child ate slowly, sitting up on the stone, the quilt around her shoulders, her eyes reflecting the low glow from the firebox grate. Her fingers had gone from white to swollen red, and she held the bread carefully, as though her hands belonged to someone else and she was learning how to use them. The bread was the final proof, though Amalia did not think of it that way. She had set dough to rise on the stone slab the evening before the storm. It had risen slowly through the night, the yeast feeding on warmth that came not from flame, but from stone that remembered flame. After the morning burn, when the firebox was empty and the channels held their stored heat, she laid the loaves on the stone and covered them with a clay pot Raisa had given her. The residual heat baked them slow, not oven hot, not fast, but the crust hardened and the center cooked, and the smell filled the shack with something that was not survival. It was life. It was rye sourdough and warmth, and the proof that the stone remembered what the fire had taught it. She baked 3 loaves that way during the storm. The first she cut with a kitchen knife and shared with Eli, the bread still warm from stone heat that had been fire heat 6 hours before. The second she wrapped in cloth and set aside. The third she baked on the morning of the second day, when the fuel bundles were down to 7 and the wind had not eased, and she baked it not because she needed bread, but because the act of baking meant the system still worked. The channels drew, the stone held, the heat remained. A woman who could bake bread during a blizzard was a woman whose house was not a coffin. The sour smell turned sweet as the crust darkened, and the shack smelled like her grandmother's kitchen, and for a moment that lasted exactly as long as the smell. No longer, Amalia was not afraid. The near-death moment came on the second morning. Amalia heard it before she saw it. A metallic rattle, fast, sharp, rhythmic. The stovepipe joint where the channel's exit met the chimney base was vibrating. Wind had shifted east and was hitting the chimney at a new angle, and the joint, sealed with clay and wire, was shaking loose. If the joint opened, smoke would pour from the gap directly into the room. Not the slow seep of a draft failure, a full breach. In a room this size, carbon monoxide would become lethal in minutes. Amalia climbed onto the platform. The stone was hot enough to burn through her dress at the knees. She reached the joint and saw clay falling away in crumbs as the pipe shook. She grabbed a fistful of wet clay from the bucket she kept beside the firebox and pressed it into the gap, working it around the pipe with her bare hands because cloth wraps were too thick to fit. The clay sealed. The pipe shook again. The clay cracked. She pressed more. The pipe lurched. Her right wrist struck the hot surface of the chimney base stone. The pain was a white line drawn from wrist to elbow. She pulled back but did not let go of the clay. She pressed and held and felt the burn settle into her skin like a brand. And the joint held, and the smoke drew through instead of into, and she rolled off the platform onto the floor with clay on her hands and a burn on her wrist that would leave a scar for the rest of her life. Eli was sitting up on the bed, staring. "Is it fixed?" the child asked. Amalia looked at her wrist. A welt, bright red, already blistering. She pressed a wet cloth against it and hissed through her teeth. "It is fixed." The pain confirmed what the thermometer could not. The stone was still charged. The platform still held heat. After 2 days of blizzard, after wind that had killed livestock standing in fields and trapped families in houses and shut down telegraph and rail, the channels still drew and the stone still gave back what the fire had given it. Not because the stone was generous, because the stone was heavy and patient and had nowhere else to send the warmth. The storm broke on the third morning, not all at once. The wind dropped from a scream to a moan, and then from a moan to a sigh, and then the sun came through flat, low, blinding on the drifted snow. The world outside the shack was unrecognizable. Drifts rose above the window. The pump was buried. The cow's shed, such as it was, had collapsed under the weight. The fence posts had vanished. The land was white and formless, scoured clean of every mark that human hands had made, except the shack itself, which sat in its own drift like a stone in a snowbank, the chimney still trailing a thin line of smoke into the clearing sky. Amalia opened the door. She had to dig from inside for 20 minutes before it moved. When it swung free, cold air rushed in and the cabin temperature dropped 15 degrees in a breath. But the stone held its warmth. It would hold it for hours yet. She had fired it at dawn, a last hot charge, and the channels were full of stored heat that would bleed into the room through the afternoon. She stood in the doorway with flour on her sleeve from the bread she had been shaping when the door finally opened. Behind her, Eli Haugen sat on the warm stone wrapped in a quilt, eating a crust. On the shelf beside the bed, 4 loaves cooled. Outside, the prairie was silent, the wind was done, and somewhere to the west, a burial party was forming. They came 2 weeks after the storm, on a morning so cold the harness leather cracked when the horses moved. 4 men. Deputy Lumen Vale rode in front because he had drawn the short straw at the meeting, where Brackett said someone had to ride out and see what was left. Behind him came Brackett himself, a farmer named Kittleson who owned a canvas death sheet, and Hiram Voss, who had not been asked to come but had saddled up anyway because a frozen widow meant an open claim, and he wanted to be present when the math settled. They brought shovels. They brought a pine box lid lashed flat to a sled because a full coffin would not fit across a saddle. Vale carried a flask of whiskey for the work of digging a body out of a frozen shack, which was the kind of work that went better if a man could not feel his hands or his conscience. The ride took 2 hours. The drifts had sculpted the prairie into shapes that bore no resemblance to the land beneath them. Fence posts had vanished. The road was a guess. Vale navigated by the river bend, which he could see as a dark line of cottonwood tops above the white, and by the smoke. The smoke was wrong. It should not have been there. A cabin with a dead woman inside does not produce smoke 2 weeks after a blizzard. A cabin with a fire produces smoke, and a fire requires a living hand to feed it. And a living hand in that shack was something none of the 4 men riding toward it believed they would find. Voss saw it first. He said nothing. Brackett saw it second and pulled his horse to a stop. "That chimney is drawing," Brackett said. "Could be the shack burning," Vale offered. "A burning shack puts out black smoke, and a lot of it. That is thin. That is a stove fire." Brackett kicked his horse forward. The sled with the coffin lid scraped behind them over the crust. They reached the shack. The drift against the north wall rose above the roofline. The south side was wind-scoured down to bare boards. The chimney, clay and stone, ugly and patched, trailed a pencil line of gray into the still air. And then they smelled it, bread, yeast and crust, and the warm grain smell of rye sourdough baking. The smell came through the walls, through the cracks, through the gaps in the flour sack patches. It was impossible, and it was unmistakable, and it stopped all 4 men where they stood. Vale dismounted. He walked to the door. He pulled off his mitten to knock and heard from inside the sound of a bread crust crackling as it cooled. He knocked. The door opened. Amalia Rehm stood in the frame. She was thinner than any of them remembered. Her dress hung loose at the shoulders. Her left hand held the door frame for balance. Her right wrist was wrapped in a strip of flour sacking, stained brown where the burn wept. She looked at the 4 men, the shovels, the sled, the pine box lid. "You brought a coffin," she said. No one answered. Behind her, a child stood up from the stone platform. Eli Haugen. Pale, thinner than a 9-year-old should be, favoring her left foot where the frostbite had taken the feeling from 2 toes, but standing, alive, wrapped in a quilt on warm stone in a shack that should have been a grave. Beret Haugen was not with the burial party. She did not know. She had spent 2 weeks believing her daughter was dead, frozen somewhere between the neighbor's claim and home, buried in a drift that would not release her until spring. She had not slept through a single night since the storm. Torsten had taken the other children to stay with his brother because Beret could not stop searching the snow from the window, and the children could not stop hearing her cry. Brackett was the first of the 4 men to step inside. He did not look at Amalia. He looked at the platform. He walked to it and put his palm flat on the stone surface the way he had put his palm on the cracked stove 2 months ago when he had delivered his verdict. The stone was warm. Not faintly warm. Not residual warm. Warm the way a living thing is warm, steady, deep, radiating from a mass that had been collecting heat for weeks and had no intention of giving it up quickly. Brackett held his hand there for a long time. When he lifted it, the outline of his palm remained in the thin layer of flour dust on the surface. "How long has this been warm?" he asked. "Since December," Amalia said. Brackett looked at the firebox door, the clay chimney, the channels he could not see but whose presence he could feel in the heat beneath his hand. He looked at the fuel pile, 7 bundles of hay twists and a small stack of manure straw blocks. Not empty, not nearly as depleted as it should have been. "How much fuel did you burn during the storm?" "Less than 1/3 of what I stacked before it hit." Brackett did the math in his head. He did it again because the first answer did not make sense. A conventional iron stove in a single-wall shack would have consumed every stick of wood within 48 hours of a 3-day blizzard. The room would have gone cold the moment the fuel ran out. The woman and the child would have frozen within hours after that, but the fuel had not run out. The fire had not needed to burn continuously. The stone had done what stone does. It had stored heat during the short, hot burns and released it slowly between them, maintaining a temperature on the sleeping surface that kept a woman and a child alive through 3 days of wind that had killed livestock in open fields. "I called the shack a coffin," Brackett said. He was not speaking to Amalia. He was speaking to the room, to the stone, to the verdict he had delivered and carried with him for 2 months, like a debt. "I was wrong. It was the only house out here built for the storm." Voss had not entered. He stood in the doorway, looking past Amalia at the 4 loaves cooling on the shelf beside the bed. Bread baked by heat that was not flame. Bread baked by stone that remembered. He looked at the loaves the way a man looks at evidence he cannot argue with and does not want to accept. He did not speak. He turned and walked back to his horse and sat in the saddle and waited for the others to finish. They brought Eli home that afternoon. Beret was at the window when the riders appeared. She saw the sled and thought they had found a body. She came out of the house without a coat, without boots, running through snow that reached her thighs, and she was screaming, not Eli's name, not words, just sound, until Brackett lifted the quilt on the sled and Beret saw her daughter's face, and the sound stopped, and a different kind of silence took its place. Beret fell to her knees in the snow beside the sled. She pressed her forehead against Eli's chest and stayed there while the cold soaked through her dress, and the men looked away because some things are not meant to be watched. When she stood, she looked at Amalia, who had ridden behind the sled on Vale's horse. "You kept her alive," Beret said. "The stone kept her alive." "You built the stone." Beret's voice was not grateful. It was something harder than gratitude. It was the sound of a woman recalculating everything she had believed about another woman and finding the total changed. "I told you the stone would eat the heat. I told you it would never wake up." "It woke up," Amalia said. Beret took Eli inside. She did not say thank you. She did not need to. What she had said was worth more, an admission that she had been wrong, delivered without softening, without excuse, in the hearing of 4 men who would carry it back to town. Beret Haugen, who doubted nothing she could touch and everything she could not, had been wrong about the stone. The news spread the way all news spreads in a small town after a disaster, fast, distorted, and impossible to contain. Within a week, 3 families sent men to Amalia's shack to see the platform. They came with the skepticism of people who had heard a story too strange to believe, and the curiosity of people who had burned too much fuel during the blizzard and could not afford to burn that much again. They touched the stone. They felt the warmth. They asked questions that Amalia answered from her knees beside the firebox, demonstrating rather than explaining. She showed them the channels by opening the clean-out stone and holding a candle inside so they could see the smoke path. She showed them the clay mortar joints and the air gap behind the wall shield. She showed them the firebox door and explained why the fire must burn hot and fast, never smoldering, never damp, because a slow fire produces more smoke and less heat, and smoke that lingers in the channels deposits creosote that narrows the path and eventually blocks it. She refused to draw a single plan. "Every shack is different," she said. "Every chimney is different. Every wall distance is different. If you copy mine exactly, you will kill yourself, because your walls are not my walls, and your chimney is not my chimney. Come to me. I will walk your floor and tell you what fits." This was Raisa's teaching, not the masonry, the caution. Raisa had said it the first week. A stove that is copied is a stove that is guessed. Every guess is a chance for smoke to find the wrong room. Brackett came back 2 days after the burial party visit. This time he brought a measuring stick and a notebook. He did not ask permission. He walked the platform, measured its length and width, measured the firebox opening, measured the distance from the chimney to the nearest wall. He crouched and put his face near the clean-out stone and breathed in the warm air coming through the gap. "The smoke in the channel," he said. "How hot is it when it reaches the chimney?" "Cool enough that I can hold my hand at the outlet. Warm, not hot. The stone takes most of the heat before the smoke gets out." "And the stone gives it back for how long?" "After a hard burn in the evening, the bed is still warm at dawn. If I burn morning and evening, the bed does not go cold." Brackett wrote this down. He wrote it the way a man writes something that contradicts his previous report and will require him to stand in front of the same people who heard that report and say he was wrong. "The men I report to will want numbers," Brackett said. "They will want to know how much fuel, how much stone, how many hours. They will want to compare it to a cord of wood in an iron stove." "Then tell them this. I burned 7 bundles during the 3-day storm. A bundle is 20 hay twists and 5 manure blocks. An iron stove in this shack would have eaten a full cord in 2 days. I do not have the mathematics to prove it. I have the fuel pile. They can come count it." Brackett closed his notebook. "I will bring them." He did. 3 elders came the following week. They counted the remaining fuel bundles. They felt the stone. They asked Amalia to fire the platform while they watched. She built a hot charge and closed the firebox door. They watched the smoke thread through the clean-out gap, visible, moving, drawing. 30 minutes later, the stone surface was warm to the touch. An hour after the fire died, it was still warm. One elder, a man named Gunderson, who had lost 30 head of cattle in the blizzard, said, "My wife has been burning 3 armloads a day since October, and the house never gets above 50. "Your house has an iron stove," Amalia said. "The heat goes up the pipe. You're warming the sky." Gunderson looked at her. He had the expression of a man hearing something obvious for the first time and being angry that it had taken this long. Amalia charged nothing. She asked only that each family bring their own stone, haul their own clay, and let her inspect every joint before the first burn. 3 families agreed immediately. By the end of January, she had walked 3 floors, marked 3 layouts in ash, and rejected 2 chimney locations that would have put smoke paths too close to wooden walls. Raisa came less often after the storm. At first, Amalia thought it was the cold. The 3-mile walk from the dugout was hard even in mild weather, and January's aftermath had left drifts that turned the prairie into a landscape of trenches and ridges. But by February, when the paths had been broken by traffic and the sun had enough strength to soften the south-facing slopes, Raisa still came only twice a week instead of 4 times. She was slower. Her bag sat heavier on her shoulder. She paused at the threshold of the shack to catch her breath, and the pause lasted longer each visit. "You're sick?" Amalia said one afternoon in late February, when Raisa had sat on the platform and not stood up for 20 minutes. "I am old." "You are sick and old." "Yes." Raisa looked at her hands, knotted, cracked, the hands of a woman who had mixed mortar and delivered babies, and dug her own husband's grave with the same fingers. "My lungs, they have been filling since autumn. The cold makes it worse." "You walked 3 miles in the cold every week to teach me." "I walked 3 miles in the cold because you were building a flue wrong, and I did not want to hear about it from the afterlife." They sat together on the warm stone. The platform had become more than a heater. It was a bench, a table, a gathering place. When Raisa visited, they sat on it the way 2 women sit at a kitchen table, facing each other, hands busy, words coming when they were ready, and silence filling the space when they were not. Raisa's teaching shifted. She no longer corrected Amalia's masonry. She corrected her teaching. "You told the Kittleson family the channels should be 20 inches apart," Raisa said. "Why?" "Because mine are 20 inches apart." "Yours are 20 inches apart because your shack is 12 feet wide and your stone is river cobble. Kittleson's house is 16 feet wide and he has cut sandstone from the bluff. His channel should be wider, maybe 24, maybe 26. The stone is softer. It takes heat faster and gives it back faster. Wider channels slow the draw and let the heat soak deeper." "I did not think of that." "That is why I am still alive, to think of things you have not thought of yet." Raisa coughed. The sound was wet and deep. "But I will not be alive much longer, and you must learn to think of them yourself." The collaboration deepened through March. Raisa made Amalia rebuild the bench extension, a 3-foot addition on the north side, lower than the main platform, with a single channel beneath it designed to warm sick children or dry wet clothes without exposing them to the firebox heat. Raisa did not help build it. She sat on the platform and watched and said nothing for 2 hours, while Amalia set stone and mixed mortar and built the turn at the extension's end. They talked while Amalia worked. Not about masonry, about the things that masonry was built between the marriages and the children, and the winters and the deaths that filled the spaces around stoves the way heat fills stone. Raisa's husband had been named Dmitri. He had built stoves for landowners in Poltava province for 30 years, and he had died in his workshop, sitting on a bench he had built, with a cup of tea that was still warm when Raisa found him. "He built things that outlasted him," Raisa said. "That is all any builder can hope for." "Did he teach you?" "He did not teach me. I watched him. For 30 years I watched. Watching is slower than teaching, but it stays longer." Raisa coughed, and the cough lasted long enough that Amalia stopped working and looked at her. "He did not believe a woman could build. I proved him wrong by mixing mortar so well that his joints held for 20 years. By the end, he trusted my mortar more than his own." Amalia set the last stone on the extension and pressed it level. You taught me more than mortar. I taught you what I could before my body stopped cooperating with my intentions. Raisa looked at the extension. Finish it. Let me see. When it was finished, Raisa inspected it. She tapped every stone. She held her candle at every joint. She put her palm on the surface after a test burn and kept it there. It is good, she said. It was the first time she had said that without adding a correction. Now tear it out and build it again without me watching. Why? Because the day I am not here, you will need to know you can do this alone. Not because I told you it was right, because you know it is right. Amalia tore it out. She rebuilt it the next day while Raisa stayed in her dugout. The following morning, Raisa came walking slower than ever, stopping twice on the path to cough into a cloth that came away spotted and inspected the work. She tapped. She listened. She held her candle. She said nothing, which was better than good. Raisa Kravitz died on the 4th of April, 1888. She died in her dugout on a pallet of straw and blankets, with the earthen walls close around her and the sound of snow melt dripping through the ceiling. Amalia was with her. She had walked the 3 miles that morning because Raisa had not come in 5 days, and the silence had the wrong weight. Raisa's last teaching was not about masonry, it was about restraint. A stove that keeps too much heat keeps smoke too, she said. Her voice was thin, the words pushed through lungs that were more water than air. You will want to make them bigger, more channels, more mass, more heat. Do not. A platform should give back what a family needs and no more. If you chase heat, you trap smoke. If you trap smoke, you kill the people you are trying to warm. Amalia held her hand. Raisa's fingers were cold, which was wrong. Cold hands in a woman who had spent her life knowing where heat should go. You are a good builder, Raisa said. You are not yet a good teacher. A good teacher makes the student believe they built it themselves. You still want credit. I do not want credit. Then stop signing your name in the ash when you mark a floor. She closed her eyes. An hour later, her breathing changed. 10 minutes after that, it stopped. Amalia buried her beside her husband in the small cemetery behind the Lutheran church, where the German and Norwegian and Ukrainian dead lay in rows that did not separate by language or country because the ground did not care where you were from. She dug the grave herself, the way she had dug Joseph's, and when it was done, she stood beside it with dirt on her hands and a silence inside her that was not empty. It was full of candle lessons and mortar lessons and the particular weight of a woman's voice saying, "Ask me in January," and meaning by that, I will still be here in January to answer. Except she would not be, not anymore. The knowledge was Amalia's now, received, held, carried forward the way heat is carried in stone. Not because the stone chose to hold it, because the stone was heavy enough that the heat had nowhere else to go. 3 weeks after Rice's death, the secondary crisis arrived. A late-season blizzard, not as savage as the January storm, but wet and heavy, the kind of spring snow that collapses roofs and turns roads to mud beneath a white surface. It hit on a Tuesday when the Redstone Crossing schoolhouse was full of children, 14 students ranging from 6 to 15, and Miss Adela Strand, who was 23 and had been teaching for 1 year and had never managed a building emergency. The coal delivery had not come. The supply wagon from the county seat was overdue by 4 days, delayed by mudslides on the freight road. The schoolhouse stove had burned through its reserve by Monday afternoon. Miss Strand had sent word to Voss, who controlled the town's coal supply, and Voss had sent back a message saying he would deliver a half-ton by Wednesday. Wednesday was too late. The schoolhouse had a second room, the teacherage, a small attached quarters where Miss Strand lived, and in that room stood a masonry heater that Hiram Voss had built. He had built it in February, after the news about Amalia's platform spread through town. He had hired a bricklayer from Huron for 2 days, sourced cheap brick from a demolished chimney, and constructed a squat heating bench in the teacherage that he called an improvement on the widow's rock pile. He charged the school board $42 and told them it would cut their coal bill in half. But Voss had narrowed the flue channels to save brick. He had set the bench too close to the wall, without the air gap Raisa had demanded. He had skipped the clean-out stones because the bricklayer said they weakened the structure. The heater looked solid. It heated the teacherage through mild cold. But it had never been tested in a storm, and a storm was what it got. Miss Strand lit the teacherage heater when the main stove ran dry. Within 20 minutes, the room filled with smoke. The narrowed channels could not pull enough draft in the wind. Smoke backed through every mortared joint that should have had a clean-out behind it. The children crowded into the main schoolhouse room, which was now unheated, and Miss Strand opened every window in the teacherage to vent the smoke, which dropped the temperature in both rooms to near freezing. She sent a boy running to town. The boy reached Voss's store and gasped out the situation. Voss sent the bricklayer. The bricklayer looked at the smoking heater and said he did not know what was wrong and would not touch it in a storm. Amalia arrived 40 minutes later. She had not been sent for. She had been at the general store buying lamp wicks when the boy came in, and she had listened to his description of the smoke and known immediately what was wrong. She walked to the schoolhouse in wind-driven snow, carrying a stove iron and a bucket of fresh clay. She found the teacherage full of haze. She crouched beside the heater and put her ear to the brick. She tapped. She listened. She tapped at the first turn, the second. At the second turn, the sound was dead. No resonance, no hollow channel behind the brick. Creosote, or a partial collapse, or both. Without a clean-out, there was no way to access the blockage from outside. "I need to break through here," Amalia said, pointing to the brick face at the second turn. "That will destroy the heater," Miss Strand said. "The heater is already destroyed. It just has not fallen down yet." Amalia looked at the wall behind the bench, inches from the brick, no air gap, the plaster already warm to the touch. "And this wall will catch fire before spring if someone does not move this bench away from it." She did not wait for permission. She struck the face brick with the stove iron. Once, twice. The third blow opened a hole the size of her fist, and a plug of crete andite and ash fell out, and draft surged through the opening with a sound like a gasp. Smoke reversed course and began drawing through the cleared channel and up the chimney. She patched the hole with clay, packed it around a removable stone she shaped from a broken brick, and opened the firebox. She burned a small, hot charge of dry wood. Nothing in the teacherage, just fuel brought from the schoolhouse stove pile, and watched the smoke draw clean through the channel for 10 minutes before she turned to Miss Strand. "Burn hot. Never let it smolder. Open this stone once a month and clean the channel behind it. And tell whoever built this to move it 18 inches from the wall before he kills someone." She moved to the main schoolhouse. No masonry heater there, just the empty iron stove. She carried bricks from the teacherage into the schoolhouse, heated them on the now drawing teacherage heater, and placed them in cloth wraps among the children. She rotated bricks for 3 hours until the storm eased and families came with sleds. If this story reminds you why understanding how things work matters more than just having them, share it with someone who needs to hear it, because the next part of Amalia's story is where everything Raisa taught her gets put to the test one final time. The aftermath of the schoolhouse emergency changed the town's arithmetic. Voss's heater had failed. Amalia's knowledge had saved 14 children from a night in a freezing schoolhouse. The contrast was stark enough that even Voss's allies could not smooth it over. At the next town meeting, Brackett stood and said what everyone was thinking. Ordinary stoves did not save Eli Haugen. An ordinary copy did not save the school. The widow's method works. The widow's caution is the reason it works. Beret spoke next. She had not spoken at a public meeting in 3 years of homesteading. She stood, and the room went quiet, because Beret Haugen speaking in public meant Beret Haugen had something that could not wait. My daughter is alive because of what Amalia Rehm built. My daughter would be dead if she had crawled to any other shack on the prairie. I doubted the stone. I was wrong. I will not be wrong about it again. She sat down. The silence that followed was the kind of silence that changes what a room believes. Families began asking for floor plans. Amalia refused to draw them. She repeated what she had said since January. Come to me, let me walk your floor, let me see your walls and your chimney and your distances. She walked 9 floors that spring. She approved 6 for construction. 3 she rejected. 2 because the chimney locations were too close to roof beams. 1 because the family wanted a platform so large it would have needed channels long enough to stall the draft. She charged nothing. She asked only for help hauling stone for Raisa's grave marker, which she was building from river cobble and clay mortar, a squat solid column, 3 feet tall, warm to the touch on sunny days when the dark stone absorbed the light. Voss watched all of this from behind his counter and said nothing in public. In private, he told his wife that the widow was making every cordwood pile in town worth less. His wife, who had spent the blizzard feeding their iron stove every 90 minutes while Voss was at the meeting arguing against rescue, said nothing back, which was its own kind of answer. The heater benches went up through April and May. 6 families built them, each one different. Each one walked and marked and inspected by Amalia before the first burn. 2 families added bake chambers. 1 added a bench extension for an elderly mother who could not stay warm at night. Amalia taught each family the rules: hot fire, long path, clear breath, never close a damper while there is flame, never skip the clean-out. And she watched each family's first burn from start to finish, her hand on the channel wall, her ear to the stone, listening for the draw that meant the smoke was moving and the heat was staying where it belonged. She did this work without Raisa. She did it by hearing Raisa's voice in her own head, correcting, questioning, insisting on the caution that separated a heater from a hazard. And sometimes, alone in her shack at night with her hand on the warm platform and the lamp burning low, she spoke to the stone the way she had heard Raisa speak to mortar. Quietly, practically, without sentiment. The way you speak to something that does its job and does not need praise for doing it. But Voss was not finished. He had not converted. He had not been humbled enough. And the thing about Hiram Voss was that humiliation did not make him smaller. It made him louder. His cheap schoolhouse copy had failed. His authority had been publicly questioned. His business was losing ground to a woman who charged nothing for work that made his product less necessary. He began telling people that the heater benches were fire hazards. He told them Amalia had no certification, no training, no mason's credential. He told them the schoolhouse incident proved that masonry heaters were dangerous in untrained hands, and that Amalia's hands, for all her experience, were still untrained. "One winter does not make a mason," he said. "One blizzard does not make an expert." The argument had a sliver of truth in it, which made it more dangerous than a lie. Amalia was not a mason. She had learned from a dead woman who had learned from a dead man. Her knowledge was real but uncertified, practical but unsanctioned, and in a town where Voss controlled the supply chain, unsanctioned knowledge was a threat that could be managed. He did not know, none of them knew yet, that his own house held the worst copy of all. Voss built his own heater in May. He did not ask Amalia. He did not hire the bricklayer from Huron, who had refused to return after the schoolhouse incident. He used brick salvaged from the demolished chimney of an abandoned claim he had bought for back taxes, and he laid the brick himself, working from a sketch he had made while standing in Amalia's shack during the burial party visit, a sketch drawn from memory, without measurements, without understanding the relationships between channel width and chimney height and wall distance that made the difference between a heater and a smoke trap. He built it in his parlor, against the east wall, beneath the bedroom where his 3 children slept. He made the channels narrow because narrow channels used less brick. He skipped the clean-out stones because the bricklayer had told him they weakened the structure, and Voss believed the bricklayer because believing the bricklayer cost less than believing the widow. He set the heater 14 inches from the wall instead of the 24 Amalia required because his parlor was small and his wife wanted room for the rocking chair. He fired it twice before summer and declared it sound. The channels drew. The brick warmed. The room held heat after the fire died. He told customers at the lumber shed that the widow's method was simple enough for any man with a trowel and a pile of brick, and that her insistence on personal inspection was vanity dressed as caution. Summer hid the flaws. In summer, nobody needs a heater. The mortar cured. The brick settled. The channels sat empty and dark, and nobody put a candle to the joints or tapped the walls or listened for the hollow sound that means draft has a path and the dead sound that means it does not. Autumn came. Voss fired the heater in October when the first frost hit. It drew. It warmed. He told his wife the thing worked fine, and his wife, who had spent the blizzard feeding the iron stove while Voss was at the meeting, said nothing. The cold came back in late November. Not a blizzard, not yet, but the steady, grinding Dakota cold that settles on the prairie like a weight and does not lift for months. 12 below at night, 5 above at noon. Wind from the northwest constant, pressing against every wall and finding every crack. The iron stoves in Redstone Crossing ate fuel at their winter rate, and the 6 families with Amalia's heater benches burned half as much and slept warm. Voss burned his heater hard. Morning and evening, full charges, the firebox packed with wood because he did not trust hay twists and manure blocks the way the widow did. The channels filled with hot smoke, and the brick absorbed it, and the parlor warmed. But the channels were narrow. The smoke moved too fast through them, depositing creosote on the brick surfaces, a black terry residue that builds when smoke cools too quickly against cold masonry instead of transferring heat evenly through a wider, slower path. Without clean-out stones, the creosote accumulated unseen. By mid-November, the effective channel width had decreased by 1/3. By late November, the draft had slowed enough that smoke seeped through mortar joints on the coldest nights, filling the parlor with a haze that Voss's wife could smell and Voss refused to acknowledge. "It is settling," he said. "New masonry smokes." "Amalia's does not smoke," his wife said. "Amalia's is made of river rock and river mud. Mine is made of brick." He did not open the channels because there were no clean-out stones to open. He did not move the heater from the wall because moving it would mean admitting the placement was wrong. He fed it harder and hoped the problem would solve itself because Hiram Voss had built his career on the principle that problems solve themselves if you refuse to look at them long enough. His youngest son, Willem, was 7. The boy had been coughing since November. A wet cough, deep in the chest, the kind that starts as a cold and settles into the lungs like a tenant who will not leave. The doctor in Redstone Crossing, a man named Evers, who had trained in Chicago and practiced in Dakota because Chicago did not want him, diagnosed a chest fever and prescribed warmth, rest, and steam. Warmth was the problem. The iron stove in the bedroom overheated the room when fed, and froze it when empty. The masonry heater in the parlor was supposed to provide steady warmth, but the creosote narrowed channels now produced as much smoke as heat. Willem slept in the parlor because the parlor was warmer than the bedroom, and he breathed the smoke that seeped through the mortar joints. And the smoke made the cough worse, and the cough made the fever worse. And by the 1st of December, the boy could not lie flat without choking. Voss's wife moved Willem to the bedroom. The bedroom was cold. She fed the iron stove until the stovepipe glowed. The room overheated. Willem sweated. She let the stove die. The room plunged. Willem shivered. The cycle repeated, hot, cold, and the boy's lungs could not find a temperature to settle in, and the fever climbed. On the 3rd of December, Voss came to Amalia's door after midnight. She heard the horse before the knock. The hooves on frozen ground had a particular sound in the quiet, sharp, urgent, the sound of an animal being ridden harder than the hour required. She opened the door in her coat, her hair unbraided, the platform warm behind her. The cold came in with the starlight, and standing in it was Hiram Voss. He was not wearing his hat. His coat was unbuttoned. His face was the face of a man who had come to the last door he wanted to open and found it the only one still standing. There was no calculation in it, no angle. For the first time since Amalia had known him, Hiram Voss looked like a man who had run out of ways to solve a problem by himself. "My boy cannot breathe," he said. Amalia stood in the doorway and felt the weight of the moment settle around her like a coat. She could have said many things. She could have quoted his own words back to him, the tomb with the chimney, the curing like ham, the lost senses, the offer to buy her claim for a dead man's debt. She could have reminded him that he had argued against sending a rescue party when she was trapped in the blizzard with another man's child. She could have reminded him that he had called her heater a fire hazard, had told the town her hands were untrained, had built a cheap copy without her inspection, and marketed it as an improvement on her rock pile. She could have closed the door and gone back to her warm stone and let the night deliver whatever lesson it was going to deliver. She thought of Raisa. Not of anything Raisa had said about masonry or mortar or draft. She thought of Raisa walking 3 miles in the cold to teach a woman she did not know, because the woman was building a flue wrong, and building a flue wrong could kill her. Raisa had not asked whether Amalia deserved help. She had asked whether Amalia needed it. The boy was not the father. Amalia put on her boots and picked up her stove iron and her bucket of clay. "Show me," she said. She walked into Voss's parlor and knew within 10 seconds what was wrong. The heater was too close to the wall. The mortar joints were seeping. The air in the room carried the thin, acrid smell of creosote smoke, not enough to choke a healthy adult, but enough to inflame the lungs of a sick child who had been sleeping in it for weeks. She crouched beside the heater and put her ear to the brick. She tapped. At the first turn, dead sound. At the second turn, dead sound. Both channels were narrowed to the point of failure. "You have no clean outs," she said. The bricklayer said, "The bricklayer was wrong. I need to open this wall." She pointed to the brick face at the first turn. "And this one." She pointed to the second. "That is my heater. I built it. It is killing your son." Amalia said it without raising her voice. She said it the way Raisa would have said it, as a fact, stated once, not repeated. "The channels are clogged with creosote. The smoke is leaking into the room. Willem has been breathing it for weeks. If you want to argue about who built what, argue after the boy can breathe. Right now, I need to open these channels, or you need to let that fire go out and carry Willem into the cold." Voss stood in his own parlor, in his own house, looking at the heater he had built with his own hands, and he did not move. His wife stood in the bedroom doorway with Willem's coughing behind her, like a clock counting down. Brackett stepped through the front door. He had been sleeping in the room he kept above the jail, and Voss's wife had sent the oldest boy to fetch him before Voss rode to Amalia's claim, not because she needed the marshal, but because she knew her husband would need someone to make him step aside. "Let her work, Hiram," Brackett said. Voss looked at Brackett. He looked at Amalia. He looked at the bedroom door where his wife held the frame with both hands, and his son coughed in the dark. He stepped back. Amalia struck the brick face at the first turn. The stove iron rang against the masonry, and the first brick cracked and fell inward, and behind it was a channel so narrowed with creosote that she could barely fit her hand through. Black residue coated every surface. She scraped it out with the iron, handful after handful, the tarry buildup falling onto the hearth in chunks that smelled like burned pitch. She opened the second turn. Same condition. The channel was nearly sealed. Another month and the heater would have stopped drawing entirely, and the smoke would have had nowhere to go except into the room, and the room would have become lethal. She cleaned both channels. She packed the openings with removable stones. Bricks she shaped with the iron and seeded in clay, so they could be accessed again without demolition. She rebuilt the mortar around the breaches and let it set. Then she looked at the wall. 14 inches between the heater and the parlor wall. The plaster was discolored, a yellow-brown stain that started at the heater's height and climbed toward the ceiling. She pressed her hand against the wall. Warm, not from the room, from the brick radiating through 14 inches of dead air. "This wall needs to move, or the heater needs to move," she said. 14 inches is not enough. The plaster is cooked. If there is lath behind this and the lath is dry, this wall will ignite the next time you run a full burn in high wind. "I cannot move the wall." "Then you move the heater, 10 inches back, minimum, and you build a clay shield between the heater and the wall with an air gap. I will show you how." Voss said nothing. Amalia turned to the parlor stove, the iron stove that had been the backup. She built a small fire. She heated bricks on the stove top, not masonry heater bricks, just common bricks from the stack beside the chimney. She wrapped them in cloth and carried them to the bedroom. She placed 2 at Willem's feet and 1 against his chest. She opened the bedroom window a crack, enough to let cold air in, enough to let smoke residue out. "He needs clean air more than he needs warm air," she said to Voss's wife. "Keep the parlor fire out until the channels are clear and the heater is moved. Use the iron stove for heat. Rotate bricks every hour. If the cough gets worse before morning, send for Evers." She did not stay. She picked up her iron and her bucket and walked out into the December dark and rode Voss's horse back to her claim because Voss did not offer and she did not ask. Willem's cough broke 2 days later. The fever followed it down. By the end of the week, the boy was sitting up and eating broth, and his mother had moved the rocking chair and hired 2 of Beret's boys to help Voss shift the heater 10 inches from the wall. Amalia came back to inspect the new position and build the clay shield herself because she did not trust Voss to do it, and she did not want a dead child on her conscience, even if the child's father had wanted a dead widow on his. Voss's conversion came at the next town meeting. He did not apologize. Amalia had not expected him to, and an apology from Hiram Voss would have sounded so wrong that it would have undone whatever sincerity it carried. What he said was harder than an apology and cost him more. He stood in front of the men and women who bought his wood and his coal and trusted his judgment on matters of winter survival, and he said, "I built a heater in my parlor without the widow's inspection. It nearly killed my son. The channels were clogged. The wall was cooking. I did not know because I did not put in cleanouts and I did not ask for help." He paused. The room waited. "Do it her way or do not do it," Voss said. "That is what I have learned." He sat down. The silence that followed was not the silence of agreement or sympathy. It was the silence of a town recalibrating its understanding of who knew what, and who could be trusted, and what it cost to learn the difference. Voss had been the man people went to for winter supplies. Now Voss was the man who had almost smoked his own child to death. The authority had shifted, and it had shifted to a 32-year-old widow who charged nothing and insisted on doing the work herself. Amalia, sitting in the back row, did not speak. She did not need to. Voss had said the only thing that mattered, and he had said it in front of everyone, and the cost of saying it was visible in the set of his jaw and the way he did not look at her when he sat down. Nolan Prudy arrived in Redstone Crossing in the spring of 1889. He was 38, a widowed wheelwright from Worthington, Minnesota, who had lost his wife to typhoid, and his shop to the creditors who arrived before the funeral flowers wilted. He came to Dakota because Dakota was where men went when every other direction was closed, and he filed on a quarter section 2 miles west of town with $60, a set of woodworking tools, and a draft horse that was the only thing the creditors had not taken because the horse had bitten the auctioneer. He heard about the widow's heaters within a week, not because anyone told him directly, but because in a town of 400 people, the story of the woman who survived the blizzard on warm stone was the story everyone told when they had nothing else to say. It had replaced the weather as the default conversation. Prouty came to Amalia's shack in April to see the platform for himself. He was not interested in building one. He was interested in the iron components, the firebox doors, the clean-out plates, the damper handles, that Amalia had been scrounging from ruined stoves and broken hardware. Every piece was a compromise. Every piece had been designed for a different purpose and forced into service here, and the gaps between intention and use were filled with clay and patience, and the understanding that good enough was not good, but was all she had. Prudy crouched beside the firebox and studied the door for a full minute before speaking. "These doors do not fit right," he said. "The hinge is from a cook stove. The frame is too wide by 1.25 inches. You have clay packed around it to seal the gap, and the clay cracks every time you open it because the clay is rigid and the hinge is not." "I know." "Every crack lets air in where you do not want it. Uncontrolled air feeding a hot fire means uncontrolled burn. You lose the ability to manage the charge." "I know that too." Prouty looked at her. He had the expression of a man who was accustomed to identifying problems and not accustomed to finding that someone else had already identified them and simply lacked the tools to fix them. "I can build you a door that fits. Iron frame, iron plate, pin hinge, sized for this opening." He measured the firebox with a folding rule and wrote the numbers on his palm with a pencil stub. "I can build clean-out plates, too. Flat iron with a handle, set in a clay seat. Pull the handle, the plate comes out, you clean the channel, no more breaking brick with a stove iron." "What do you want for it?" "I want to understand how the thing works. The iron I can build, the stone I cannot. But I can build iron that makes the stone easier to use, and that is worth something to every family that is hauling river rock right now." He was not flattering her. He was solving a problem the way a wheelwright solves a problem, by looking at the joint where two materials meet and asking whether the joint could be stronger. Amalia recognized the quality because it was the same quality she recognized in herself, the ability to look at something broken and see not the break, but the repair. They stood on opposite sides of the firebox, a wheelwright and a widow, and the space between them was filled with the particular understanding of two people who had lost everything except the knowledge of how to make things work. Prudy built the first proper firebox door in his makeshift workshop, a lean-to with a forge he had assembled from salvage. The door was iron, flat, with a pin hinge and a latch that seated flush against a clay gasket Amalia molded to the frame. It sealed clean. No smoke leaked around the edges. The firebox drew better with the fitted door than it had with the scavenged cook stove plate. He built clean-out plates next. Then bread peels, flat iron paddles sized for the bake chamber Amalia had added above the firebox. Then a chimney cap with a wind baffle that kept down draft from reversing the flue in crosswinds. Each piece was designed after he watched Amalia work, identified the point where improvisation was costing her time or safety, and built something that removed the cost. Their courtship happened inside this work, not beside it, not after it, inside it. They did not walk together, or sit together, or make speeches about feelings. They built together. He forged, she mortared. He measured, she tested. The language between them was the language of tolerances and fits, and the particular satisfaction of an iron door closing against a clay seat with a sound like a book shutting. Tight, final, correct. Beret noticed before anyone else. "He built you a door," she said one afternoon, watching Prouty ride away from the shack. "He builds doors for everyone." "He built yours first." Beret paused. "And he rode 2 miles to deliver it when the general store is 200 yards from his shop." Amalia did not answer, but she did not deny it either, and Beret, who understood silence better than most people understood speech, nodded and said nothing more. By the following winter, the winter of 1889, 6 claims had heater benches. The schoolhouse had a safe warming wall that Amalia had designed and Prouty had fitted with iron components. The teacherage had been rebuilt, with the heater moved to the center of the room, 24 inches from the nearest wall, with clean-out plates at every turn. Redstone Crossing kept a shared plan book in the general store. Not plans, exactly, but warnings written in Amalia's hand. No whetstone near fire. No narrow smoke turns. No closed damper before flame death. No wood wall without clay shield. No heater built without inspection. Each warning was a lesson someone had learned the hard way. The first was Amalia's own, the test stones Raisa had made her tap and listen to. The second was the schoolhouse, where Voss's narrowed channels had nearly smoked 14 children. The third was Raisa's first teaching, the candle lesson, the rule she had repeated until it lived in Amalia's hands like memory in stone. The fourth was the clay shield Raisa had insisted on, the air gap that kept heat from cooking the wall behind it. The fifth was Voss's parlor, where a heater built without inspection had poisoned a child. Each warning was written in language simple enough for a man who could not read English to understand through the drawings Amalia added beside them, a stone with cracks and an X through it, a channel with arrows showing smoke direction, a damper with a flame, and a skull. Prouty built a wooden frame for the book and hung it on a nail beside the door, and anyone who wanted to build a heater was told to read it first and visit Amalia second. The community bake oven came in the summer of 1889. Prouty built the stone foundation, reinforced, level, set on packed earth beside the general store. Amalia designed the flue channels in the bake chamber, a domed space above the firebox large enough for 6 loaves at a time. She mixed the mortar herself, the same clay sand straw mixture Raisa had taught her, and she set every stone with her own hands because the bake oven was the first thing she had built for the community rather than for a family. And she wanted it right in the way Raisa had meant right, not just functional but lasting. The oven's first bake was a Saturday in August. 12 families brought dough. The firebox burned for an hour, hot and fast. The fire died. The stone held the heat. 20 loaves went in, and the bread that came out was the best bread Redstone Crossing had ever eaten, not because the recipe was special, but because the heat was even and patient and held by stone that did not hurry. Women who had baked in iron stoves all their lives touched the oven walls after the bread came out and felt the warmth still living in the stone. and something shifted in their understanding of what a fire could do after the flame was gone. Prudy stood beside Amalia while the bread cooled. He did not say anything about the oven or the bread or the families gathered around it. He said, "The door hinge is dropping a quarter inch on the left side. I will fix it tomorrow." Amalia looked at him. He was looking at the hinge. "Thank you," she said. "It is just a hinge." "I know." They married that autumn. Amalia proved up on the claim in the spring of 1890. 5 years of residence as the law required. The land was hers, not Joseph's, not the government's, not Hiram Voss's. Hers. She signed the papers at the county seat with the same hand that had dug Joseph's grave and hauled 2 tons of river stone and sealed a stovepipe joint while her wrist burned. She married Nolan Prouty that autumn in the Lutheran church, with Beret as witness, and Eli Haugen carrying a bundle of dried hay twists instead of flowers because Eli said hay twist were what had kept her alive and they seemed more honest than roses. Brackett attended. Voss did not. His wife came and sat in the back row and left before the reception, which was held in the schoolhouse beside the warming wall Amalia had built, and the room was warm enough that people took off their coats and stayed past dark. Amalia raised Eli for 2 winters while Beret recovered from an illness that left her too weak to manage 4 children and a homestead at the same time. Eli slept on the warm stone platform in Amalia's shack, the same stone that had saved her during the blizzard, and she grew up knowing the sound of a proper draft and the feel of a well-set mortar joint the way other children knew the sound of church bells and the feel of Sunday cloth. She learned to tap stones and listen. She learned to hold a candle near a flue and read the flames lean. She was 10 years old, and she could tell you whether a channel was clear by pressing her ear to the wall, and she was the only child in Beadle County who could do that, and she was proud of it in the quiet way that children are proud of knowledge adults do not think to teach them. The heater benches spread. 6 became 12. 12 became 20. Families from other townships sent word asking for the widow. They still called her the widow, even after she married, because the story was the widow's story, and the name had become the name of what she built as much as who she was. She could not walk every floor. She trained Beret's oldest boy, Torsten Jr., to do the inspection she could not reach. She trained Prouty to recognize the dead sound of a blocked channel and the hollow sound of a clear one. The knowledge moved outward from her hands into other hands, the way heat moves from stone into air, slowly, evenly, without asking to be noticed. Voss sold cordwood until he died. He never apologized to Amalia. He did not need to. What he had said at the town meeting, do it her way or do not do it, was more durable than an apology, because an apology can be taken back and a public instruction cannot. He sent his wife to Amalia's shack once a month to have the family heater inspected, and he paid for the iron clean-out plates Prouty built to replace the clay-seeded bricks, and he did not complain about the cost. That was his conversion. It was not warm, it was not generous. It was the conversion of a practical man who had calculated the price of pride and found it higher than the price of iron. The first winter after the blizzard, people still stacked cordwood chips and hay twists. They still fed iron stoves. They still woke in the dark to load fuel into fireboxes that forgot the heat as fast as they made it. But they stopped believing fuel alone was safety. They learned to ask where heat went after flame. They learned to ask what the walls did with the warmth, and what the stone did, and what the chimney took that it did not need to take. 6 benches became 12. A schoolhouse wall became a county story. The poorest families copied not the size of Amalia's heater, but the principle: burn hot, slow the path, store the heat, respect the smoke. Amalia Rehm lived out her life on the James River claim she had been told to sell. She and Prouty added 2 rooms and a proper stone chimney. They had 3 children, each of whom learned to mix mortar before they learned to ride. In later years, the children who passed through her kitchen remembered it by 3 things: the smell of rye bread, the white scar on her wrist, and the warm stone ledge where sick calves, wet mittens, and frightened children all seemed to end up. When Brackett first stood in her shack, he said, "That shack will be a coffin before January is over." 2 weeks after the children's blizzard, he rode back carrying a shovel meant for that coffin. But the door opened. The widow stood there with flour on her sleeve and a burn on her wrist. Behind her, a child slept on warm stone. On the shelf, 4 loaves cooled in a room the blizzard had failed to claim. Outside, the burial sled waited empty while bread steam fogged the frozen doorway,